Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 2024 Archaeology Hour. My name is Laura Galinsky, and I'm currently serving as the Secretary of the AIA Chicago Society. Many thanks to Meredith Langlitz and Rachel Mead for the invitation to host and the assistance in preparing for tonight and making the entire series. The AIA is North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization with over 200,000 members worldwide, ranging from vocational archaeologists, students in archaeology and related fields, to enthusiasts and interested members of the community. The AIA is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things archaeological. And every member of the Archaeological Institute of America receives a subscription to Archaeology Magazine and the option to also tag on a subscription to the more scholarly American Journal of Archaeology. In addition to our publications, the AIA offers opportunities to attend lectures of interest, such as this one, and other organized events related to local, national, and international archaeological sites and finds, and even chances to participate in excavations and tours. You can get access to all these things by becoming a member of the AIA. Many thanks to all AIA members and friends who have either joined or renewed your membership recently. Your membership fees contribute to good and important work across the globe, supporting research, excavation, education, and preservation efforts. If you haven't joined yet and are interested in doing so, we would appreciate it if you would take a few minutes when and if you can to support the AIA and its mission. You can do this by scanning this QR code, or you can come back anytime to archaeological.org/join. I believe Rachel will also drop it into the chat, into the Zoom chat for you to follow from there. When you do so, take a second to designate your local society, such as the Chicago Society, and be sure to take advantage of the variety of member benefits. Students in the audience, especially, you should note that annual memberships start as low as $30 a year. To all of you, whether you are members or donors or both, we are grateful for your support. You are the ones who make it possible to continue research, fund educational experiences for students, preserve sites, publish new and exciting discoveries, and run programs for students, professionals, and archaeological enthusiasts. We have had a terrific lineup of speakers for you this year representing archaeology around the world. This is the last archaeology hour of the current season, but you can catch any of the previous presentations on the AIA YouTube channel. You can also check out any of the local societies' upcoming in-person events. If you're in the Chicago area, save the date for May 8th for a talk on landscape archaeology of the ancient Near East by Dr. Mernoush Sarouche from the University of Chicago. Just a quick note, this lecture is a live presentation that is being recorded by the AIA. Recording by attendees is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that viewers do the same. Thank you very much for your cooperation. There's no need to record anyway. If you can't stay for the full talk or you want to rewatch it, tonight's presentation, just like all of the Archaeology Hour talks, will be available on the AIA YouTube channel. Now for tonight's guest. Dr. Deborah Carlson received her PhD in classics from the University of Texas at Austin in 2004. She joined the faculty of the Nautical Archaeology program in the Department of Anthropology at Texas A&M University in the same year. Dr. Carlson teaches a graduate seminar in classical seafaring and undergraduate courses in Greek archaeology, Roman archaeology, nautical archaeology, and Latin. Her research focuses on the ships and shipwrecks of the ancient Greeks and Romans. She has directed the excavation of two ancient shipwrecks, 5th century BC and 1st century BC, off the coast of Turkey. Her archaeological fieldwork has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Geographic Society, the Archaeological Institute of America, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Samuel Kress Foundation. Since 2011, Dr. Carlson has served as president of the nonprofit Institute of Nautical Archaeology, which affiliated with Texas A&M in 1976. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlson.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for that very warm introduction. I'm going to get my slideshow running, I hope. Super. Fun to see in the chat all these great folks chiming in from different parts of the country and the world. I am honored to be here tonight for AIA's Archaeology Hour and to share with all of you some of my work from the world of underwater archaeology. I have long thought of the AIA and INA, the nonprofit organization you just heard about, which I serve as president. I have long thought of AIA and INA as sister organizations, and that is even more true now, since I think of AIA President Liz Green, who is also an underwater archaeologist, as a sister. So INA, as you can see in the graphic at the top of the slide, just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. INA, as you know, is affiliated with Texas A&M University and was founded by Dr. George Bass, who is regarded around the world as the father of underwater archaeology. And George earned this title by being the first archaeologist to excavate a shipwreck underwater, applying the same techniques and standards of accuracy that were used on terrestrial excavations. George did this in 1960 at the site of Cape Gelidonia, Turkey, when he was still a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. So INA's history in Turkey goes back really to George's pioneering excavations there in 1960. But today, INA archaeologists work all over the world, from the Mediterranean to the New World, excavating and researching ancient and medieval ships, ships of discovery, ships from the American Revolutionary and Civil Wars. Because of Dr. Bass's pioneering field work, we have been working in Turkey longer than anywhere else. INA built, owns, and operates a research center in Bodrum, Turkey, which is also home to the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. And I'll just point out here, Bodrum on the map, down here in southwestern Turkey. The site of the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck that George excavated in 1960 was right in this area. And the shipwreck that I'll be talking about this evening is over here on the Aegean coast of Turkey. So if you haven't ever been to Turkey, you can appreciate why nautical archaeologists really love this country, because it has so much fascinating coastline. And we will actually see the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology later in the presentation. So here we have a short list of INA shipwreck excavations in Turkey, and I realize many of you in the audience will recognize some of these sites that have been excavated by INA, sites like Yasada, Serçe-Limanı, of course, Kızılburun. And the wreck that I'll be talking about this evening is the one at Kizilburun, which was excavated, as you see, between 2005 and 2011. So here we can see Kızılburun, the site of Kizilburun, which in Turkish means Crimson Cape. There on the western coast of Turkey, really just directly opposite from the Greek island of Chios in the Aegean Sea. And I hope you can appreciate in the image on the right that this is a really barren, uninhabited, remote stretch of coastline, no electricity, no running water. It was about 45 minutes by boat to the nearest tiny fishing village. And you can see this little dot here is our research vessel, which was moored in the lee of the cape. And this dot is actually our catamaran, which we moored over the wreck and then served as an excavation platform. So here you see one of several excavation camps that we built at the site of Kizilburun. Anything we needed to carry out 3 months of excavation, we had to supply ourselves. And you can see our old research vessel, Virazan, which has now been replaced by a new research vessel, Virazan 2. But Virazan is moored there in front of our camp, and we had some members of the team sleeping on the research vessel and some sleeping in camp. But what I can't show you is the look on the faces of the graduate students who joined us at Kizilburun and formed part of our excavation team, when they first laid eyes on those summer accommodations, it was a pretty priceless expression, sort of, you know, I think tainted with horror, frankly. But by the end of every summer, we were a very close-knit family. And, you know, I had to remind them from time to time that people pay a lot of money to find places on Earth where there is no cell phone service or no emails. Working away from the excavation camp, we'd go out to our catamaran, which again served as a platform moored over the shipwreck site, and diving down to a depth of between 45 and 48 meters, which is about 150 or 160 feet, we set our sights on excavating this ancient shipwreck. And this wreck was found during an annual shipwreck survey directed by my colleague Jamal Pulak in 1993, one of many AINA annual shipwreck surveys. So again, we're working at a depth of about 150 feet, and you can see these blue pipes here sort of scattered around the shipwreck. Those are airlift pipes. So that's how we excavate underwater. We fix together 2 6-meter long lengths of irrigation pipe and then fix that at a 45-degree angle to the seabed. They look sort of curved because of the parallax in the lens, but we then run compressed air down from the surface with a hose, and you can see that hose here. And you put the hose in the mouth of the airlift pipe, which again is fixed at a 45-degree angle. And when the air goes in the mouth of that pipe and travels upward, it expands. And as it expands, it creates a vacuum or suction. And that's essentially how we excavate very carefully on the seabed. But I think you can appreciate rather quickly that this shipwreck looked very different from most of the ancient shipwrecks we find in the Mediterranean, because most of those shipwrecks feature amphoras, or 2-handled clay transport jars that were used to transport or ship commodities, most of them comestible or edible commodities, all over the Mediterranean and even beyond the Mediterranean. So our cargo clearly is architectural, and is from the very beginning of the excavation, we realized that it is characterized by column drums. We had 8 column drums, and you can see 1 there, 2 there. There's basically 4 pairs. You can't really see the ones in the back of the image, but you should be able to make out the 4 pairs of column drums, and then this rather curious architectural element that sits on top of the drum pile. And we knew that that was a significant diagnostic element because we thought it must either be the base of a column shaft, presumably an Ionic or Corinthian column shaft, or the capital of a Doric column. So even though the drums are covered with a layer of marine growth or incrustation, still from the very beginning, we set about measuring those column drums, and we realized that they're all slightly different in diameter. And we were intrigued to find that the smallest of the 8 column drums matched the diameter of this smallest column drum matched almost exactly the diameter of this portion of this curious architectural element. So that suggested to us that in fact we were looking at the capital of a Doric column as opposed to the base of an Ionic or Corinthian column. So that was our understanding of the wreck. Again, really going into the excavation in 2005. As the excavation got underway, we realized fairly quickly that here you can see the very surface of one of the 8 marble drums. So all of this stuff is the marine crust or the marine encrustation that accumulates over the millennia. But down here, beneath the silty seabed that we're excavating away, you can actually see the original surface of that marble drum. And it's important because of what you don't see. What you don't see are flutes or channels carved into that column drum. So let me show you, just by contrast, an example of a partially fluted column drum. And this comes from Athens. This has nothing really to do with our shipwreck, but it's a good illustration of the fact that ancient architects stacked all of the column drums, one on top of the other, in place, and then fluted the entire column shaft. So the fact that our column drums have no fluting clearly told us that this cargo, these architectural elements, were not salvaged from an existing building, but rather were newly quarried and were presumably being shipped to a construction site. So we were curious to know when that happened and figure out the date of the wreck. As the excavation progressed for the first 3 years, I would say, we uncovered this adjacent sort of secondary cargo, this area which you see in the slide, which featured many smaller marble artifacts. So here we have the drum pile on the left, and this is our column capital. And here you can actually see the amount of sediment that we excavated away. But in doing so, we exposed all of these artifacts there on the seabed adjacent to the drum pile. And 2 of them were particularly interesting. I was actually tasked with excavating the object on the right. And if you can sort of imagine yourself there hovering above this artifact, which looks like a spool. And for a time, I thought to myself, I'm actually excavating the volute of a capital, and we've got this all wrong. We're not excavating a Doric column. This is, in fact, the volute of an Ionic capital. In fact, I was wrong, and I was happy to be wrong. In what I was excavating was the pedestal of a basin. And we have in the cargo from Kizilburun 2 of these spool-shaped pedestals and 2 of these large, broad basins. So these 2 items together, and we know they go together because the pedestal has a mortise cut into it that would have received the basin. But these 2 items together created what is essentially a luterion, or a wash basin. And these are often found in sacred contexts, like sanctuaries. And the image you're seeing on the left actually comes from the sanctuary of Apollo at Pompeii. Some of the other marble artifacts that we uncovered in the course of the excavation at Kızılburun include this small, roughly finished basin, so a much smaller version of the larger one I just showed you. This might also, in fact, be a mortar, but what's particularly interesting about it is that it's not finished. So you can see the pick marks, or the quarry marks of the quarry tools, actually inside the interior of this mortar. And you can see again that it's not finished. This artifact is what we call, it's being shipped in a quarry state. So it's sort of roughed out, you know what it is, but it hasn't received the final finishing touches that it will when it reaches the marble workshop for which it was destined, which obviously didn't happen. Again, adjacent to the drum pile, in the course of this excavation, we uncovered a number of large rectangular marble slabs, and even some that looked sort of more like steps. Sort of difficult to know how these might have functioned because they are essentially blanks. But we did find about a half dozen marble slabs that have this lovely sculpted pediment. And these are very clearly stelae, or gravestones. They have the lovely pediment at the top with the central rosette, but the rest of the stelae is blank. And actually, we didn't have to go very far, just to the Archaeological Museum in Izmir, Turkey. to locate some very compelling parallels, which you see here. These, of course, are finished. So they've been sculpted. In some cases, they carry inscriptions. But these grave stelae from the Izmir Archaeological Museum actually come from ancient Smyrna or ancient Izmir and date from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. So that was one of the first compelling clues that we were likely looking at a cargo of a ship that sank in the 2nd or 1st century BC. And that's a rather interesting date, later than some might imagine, for the transport by sea of a monumental marble Doric column. Because as many of you know, in the ancient world, different architectural styles were popular at different times. So it's unusual to see Doric architecture on a monumental scale at this time in the 2nd or 1st century BC. It's certainly not unheard of, but it's still pretty unusual. We also found elements of the ship's equipment. So I'll just go through these rather quickly, but here we have actually a lead sounding weight. So this would have been cast from the side of the ship, both to measure the depth of the water in unfamiliar contexts, and also probably to grab a sample from this little indentation, which would have been smeared with some kind of grease or lard, to grab a sample of the seabed. And that was really one of the only navigational instruments that ancient sailors had. We also, of course, found anchors, and anchors can be broadly diagnostic, but some types of anchor were in production for centuries. And it can be difficult to be certain that the anchors found on the seabed are definitively associated with a specific shipwreck, because, of course, in antiquity, anchors are lost all the time. But we do have a number of these lead anchor stocks, in addition to an iron anchor, actually, from the same shipwreck. And then, of course, we found ceramics. My good friend Mark Lawal tells me he likes to go to the shipwreck sessions at the AIA's annual meeting because he's guaranteed he's going to see amphoras. And so living up to that expectation, I'm going to include some ceramics, some amphoras. We don't have nearly as many as one might expect if you're excavating an amphora carrier, but still we do have I think a very interesting ceramic assemblage. And in shipwreck contexts, these two-handled ceramic jars called amphoras were the standard container for transporting wine, oil, etc. And what I tell my students is that amphoras and shipwrecks are really symbiotic. They have a symbiotic relationship. So if you're interested in one, you better be prepared to deal with the other. So here you see us on the cover of Archaeology magazine, and that amphora is one of about 24 from the Kizilburun shipwreck. And I have to say, the wonderful thing about amphoras, like people, is their diversity. The shapes vary across time and place, kind of like wine bottles. But there's a lot you can do with amphoras. You can study the clay fabrics, you can study their contents or the residues of their contents. You might study their markings, and the markings also vary. They can be stamps that were applied before the jar was fired, or they can be graffiti that were scratched onto the jar pretty much any time after their production. So these three amphoras from the Kızılburun shipwreck, I think, give you a sense of the amount of morphological variety or diversity that one can expect in amphoras of all periods, but especially in this period in the 2nd or 1st century BC. So the one on the left comes from Knidos. The one in the middle, I think, is probably from Ionia, maybe Erythrae. And then the one on the right actually comes from Kolkis, or modern-day Georgia. So we have a pretty impressive amount of variety among the amphoras, but we don't have a very large assemblage. The largest single group of amphoras of the same type from our shipwreck look like this. And these are Lambolia II amphoras, which were produced in the Western Mediterranean in and around Italy and Croatia in the Adriatic region. So that's sort of an interesting element in trying to understand the nature of this voyage and wondering if perhaps there is a Roman connection or a connection to the Western Mediterranean in our shipwreck. But then we also have amphoras like this, and this is my problem child. This is the one that keeps me up at night, partially because it's a partial amphora. We only have the upper half of it. But it's an Egyptian jar of the bitron conique type, which should be actually a little bit later than the 1st century BC. And so one wonders, of course, what is its archaeological context? Is it found clearly in situ or in association with the other artifacts from this wreck? Could it be intrusive? Could it have been thrown overboard by a passing ship in the 2nd century AD? And to answer that, I include this image of the excavation in progress, which shows some of the artifacts we've just looked at, including the Lambolia II amphora. Here you have actually that same spool-shaped pedestal. This is the iron anchor I mentioned, and here, in what looks to me to be fairly clear archaeological association with those same artifacts, you have this partial Egyptian bitron conique amphora. So that's one of the many chronological puzzles that we will be tackling and attempting to solve. We also have ceramics from the Kizilburun shipwreck, and I was blessed to have Susan Rotroff with us for, I think, 2 seasons during the excavation at Kizilburun, as some of these these Hellenistic ceramics were coming up from the seabed, because Hellenistic ceramics are not my specialty. But you can see here again, pretty impressive variety among the assemblage. So we have a kylix in the upper left, probably from Cnidos. We have some mold-made lamps. The jar in the bottom left is, I think, an example of this very thin, sort of what we call thin-walled ware or eggshell ware. We also have mold-made bowls over there, or Megarian bowls. So fairly typical shapes and fabrics for the Hellenistic period. And then we also found this wonderful terracotta mold-made figurine. This is a figurine of a herm. Herm comes, of course, from the name Hermes, but in the ancient world, herms were essentially personified pillars, and they protected people from underworld spirits, dangerous places like crossroads, where some of these spirits from the underworld were thought to gather. Hermes, of course, was also really sort of a patron saint of sailors and merchants. So I like to think of this one mold-made herm figurine as kind of the protective icon of this ship. But in doing so, we have to acknowledge that he did a fairly lousy job protecting the ship, because the voyage obviously ended in disaster. Now, we did find one bronze coin in the course of the excavation at Kızılburun, and this is what it looks like. Sorry to all the numismatists out there who were hoping to see a beautifully preserved coin. This is the only one we found. Perhaps this was on the ship in the context of a mast step coin, because we know that the ancients at this period, at this time, often placed a coin actually under the foot of the mast in the big timber deep in the hold called the mast step. I can't prove that, but it's a subject that I like, that really interests me. What we can do, though, is talk about the coin itself. And I should acknowledge Bill Bubelis, who was really helpful to me in identifying what looks to be the best parallel for our coin. And that's an issue of Cyzicus. And Kızılburun, as many of you know, is further north in the Sea of Marmara between the Black Sea and the Aegean. And if we're right about that, then you have the head of Kore on the obverse wearing an oak leaf crown, and on the reverse of the coin you have this crown of sort of spiky grain, some of which you can see here on our not very well preserved coin from the shipwreck. But again, if we're right about the parallel, this is consistent with a date in the 2nd or 1st century BC. Now, one of the major research goals of our excavation at Kizilburun was to determine if there was any archaeological evidence that the ship preserved beneath the cargo had any construction features that might suggest it was especially built for the cargo it carried. And obviously, in order to figure this out, we had to get a close look at the hull remains. And in order to do that, we had to remove each of the 8 marble column drums. According to our calculations, each of these drums weighed between 6 and 7 tons each. And again, we were working at depths of about 150 or 60 feet, which basically meant 20 minutes of bottom time per dive. And that meant we had to work in stages to rig each of these architectural elements in order to raise them from the seabed, move them off-site, and relocate them, leaving them underwater but off of the shipwreck. And the rigging that we used, which you see on the right, consisted of these really fabulous slings. They're used in the oil industry, provided to us by a Houston-based company called Liftall. And I was really lucky to discover these lifting slings. I was even luckier when I reached out to the president of Liftall, and it turns out he's an Aggie, an A&M Aggie. So when I wrote to him to ask him for help, he manufactured these lifting slings and gave them to us for free, which was much appreciated. But we basically rigged each drum, and you can see one of the 8 drums there on the right, with these lifting slings in a choker hitch. So sort of like a choke chain that you put on your dog. We put 3 slings around each drum and then brought the ends up, as you see here, and attached the lifting slings to 2 4,000-pound lift balloons. And then we had a chain that went up to about 30 feet of water and 2 more lift balloons on the end of the chain. So that created 16,000 pounds or about 8 tons of lift. But what it meant was that when you inflated the bottom balloons, the drum didn't come off the bottom. When you inflated the top balloons in about 30 feet of water, the drum could only come off the bottom about 30 feet, because once those uppermost balloons hit the surface, they can't go any farther. So it reduced the possibility that the drum would rocket to the surface, and for that, obviously, we were very interested in protecting everyone on the seabed and on the surface. But we started this process in 2006 with the 4 drums at the lower end of the wreck site. So in this graphic, we've actually numbered the drums, but those numbers are just for our reference. They don't tell us anything about where the drum belongs actually in the column shaft. So we started that process with these 4 drums during, I think it was 2006. And then in 2007, we came back and raised the 4 drums at the slightly shallower end of the wreck site. And by our calculations, drum 4 was the largest of all 8 drums. So I want to show you a close-up of drum 4, because when we raised it from the seabed, we were really intrigued to see that it's a little bit different from the other 7 drums. It's different in that it has these funny tabs or bosses around the bottom edge. And we think that these may have been levering bosses or bosses for sliding this drum along the foundation of probably a temple, because this is the only one of the 8 drums that has these bosses. And so I want to show you here the next stage in this project after we had moved, I should say, lifted, moved, and relocated all 8 drums off site. We realized that we were missing information because the uppermost exposed part of each drum was covered with this marine growth. And we really wanted to get to the cleaner bottom surface, the one that had been protected from the elements. So we devised a system whereby we flipped each one of these 8 drums using a single lifting sling and a couple of 4,000-pound balloons, and usually the graduate student who's there holding the hose of air to supply the lift balloon. And this is pretty much what that process looked like. So as the balloons inflate and the lifting sling tightens, we were able to basically roll each drum over. And I think if I'm lucky, I'll be able to show you a video of what this looks like in real time. So that process then produced what I like to refer to as the drum garden, sort of like a beer garden, but full of column drums. So this is adjacent to the wreck site area. And here you can see the drums that have been flipped over, which gave us the opportunity to get some really more accurate measurements for each of these 8 drums. And we did that really by modeling each one of the 8 drums. And you can see here one of them, which shows that, it's not a perfect cylinder, but it's pretty darn close for something that's been quarried by hand. And then with those measurements, we were able to calculate the weight of each one of the 8 drums and the capital, which suggests that we are dealing with a total cargo of around 60 tons, which, believe it or not, is not very large when it comes to ancient marble cargoes. There are ships in the Western Mediterranean around Italy and Sicily that were carrying cargoes of 200, 250, 300 tons. So the smaller size of our ship seems significant, and one has to wonder why that is. One of the other research projects that grew out of the excavation was an analysis of the marble artifacts themselves in an effort to try to identify the source of the marble. So we began this process working with Scott Pike at Willamette University, and he looks at oxygen and carbon isotopes, stable isotope analysis, and then compares those values to marbles from ancient quarries. This is a research that was started in the 80s by a gentleman named Norman Hertz, but you can see here some of the results of those analyses, the stable isotope ratio analyses, indicate a tendency or a fondness with pretty high probability for the quarries on Proconnesus. And I'd show you this, and maybe I shouldn't because it's not my my graph, but you can see here that the picture is quite complicated in terms of overlapping quarries. There's a lot of data being generated, and it's not nearly as neat and clean as one might expect. But that's that's where the fun stuff is, to take your to really dig into those projects. So we then pursued another form of spectroscopy, electron paramagnetic resonance, with our colleague Donato Attanasio. And here again, the results came back pretty compelling for an origin of these 4 architectural pieces, suggested that their origin was again in Proconnesus. So we need to be thinking, obviously, about Proconnesus as the likely origin of this cargo and this specific voyage. So with that information, we were fairly confident that we were looking for a site where a monumental structure, almost certainly a temple, was under construction using white marble in the 2nd or 1st century BC in the Doric order. We have a good idea of where the voyage originated. We obviously know where the ship sank. And one of the challenges here is that many of those Doric buildings, many of those Doric temples that might have been candidates for our cargo are actually further north, right, in the area around Pergamon and the Troad at Assos and Ilion. So that was rather curious. And it was actually during a long weekend when there was a Turkish election that we traveled to the nearby site of Claros. Claros is home to several temples, but is best known for the oracular temple of Apollo at Claros. And this is, I think, one of the most amazing sites in the ancient world. We know that construction of this temple was begun by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. I already mentioned that this was an oracular site. So like other Apollo temples at Delphi, Delos, Didyma, inscriptions at the site, which has been excavated and studied by French and Turkish archaeologists. Inscriptions document that the Roman emperors Tiberius and also Hadrian had a hand in completing or advancing construction on the Temple of Apollo. But when Pausanias visited Claros in the 2nd century AD, he said that the temple was unfinished. So we know that the Temple of Apollo at Claros functioned as a very important center of prophecy. That's what happens at an oracular site. And we also know that the answers delivered by the priest were actually inscribed on some of the columns. So when we visited Claros during the excavation of the Kızılburun shipwreck, we were struck by the similarity in the sizes of the finished drums at Claros as compared to the unfinished drums in our shipwreck at Kizilburun. And that was essentially the challenge then, was to quantify these similarities between the finished and fluted drums at Claros, which you see on the left, and the unfluted, unfinished drums from our shipwreck on the right. So when we do this, this is what it looks like. We compared the diameter and also the height, and the height of those Claros drums was remarkably similar. But when we do this, so we have the obviously the smaller drums at Claros, smaller because they're fluted and finished, and the slightly larger drums from Kizilburun, but you can see that there's a difference, right, between these two numbers as well as between these two numbers. There's a difference of about 10 centimeters. Now that's 10 centimeters overall in the overall diameter of that drum. And 10 centimeters, if you're thinking about the external face of that drum, that's only 5 centimeters on any one surface. So that's about 2 inches. What that means is that these drums were being quarried with a quarry coat, or a thickness, a skin on them that's only about 2 inches thick. And that's what would be carved away in the fluting process when the drums reached their final destination, which again, we think with some confidence would have been Claros, that the Kizilburun column drums were destined for the Temple of Apollo at Claros. But there still remain some wrinkles and some challenges ahead. One of the most interesting challenges is that we have 8 drums on our Kizilburun shipwreck, and yet we know that the peristyle columns at the Temple of Apollo at Claros had 12 drums. How do we know that? realized that the drums have marks on them, and these marks are Greek letters. Those letters function as numbers and basically identify where in the column shaft that drum belongs. So they have been able to demonstrate that each column on the Claros temple had 12 drums, whereas we only have 8. And I promise, I swam all around the ledge on which our shipwreck sat. And we're not missing, we didn't manage to miss 4 drums. I promise we got them all, but we don't have all of the drums needed for a single column on the peristyle at Claros. Okay, just a couple more minutes. I just want to show you what happened when we raised the drums, because as I said, we were looking for evidence of the ship's hull, and we found it. It wasn't in great shape, but we also found some things we weren't expecting. So here you see some of the hull remains. We had some very flattened, squashed planking of pine. And then we also had frames, which is what you see on the right, very badly riddled with shipworm, Teredo nivalis. And those frames are actually of ash. So we have some evidence for all components of the ship's hull, but it is sadly in very fragmentary condition. One of the things we weren't expecting really to find were these marble slabs that continue under the column drums. And these are different from the marble blocks that we excavated up here. So I'm here talking about the ones that are picked out in orange. They're not actually of orange marble. They're still of Proconnesan marble. But I want to just draw your attention to these 2 marble blocks, which were found, as I think you can see, under drums 5 and 7, and they were found end to end. So this is what some of those marble blocks look like. They're roughly worked, and those 2 that I just pointed out are here in the bottom right part of the slide. And even though they were on the seabed oriented end to end, they actually fit together side by side. So I think that means that we're looking at a block that was probably on the dock or on the quay when this ship was being loaded with column drums. And they simply broke this block in order to fit it underneath the incoming column drum, perhaps to raise it up just enough so that it fit nicely inside the hold. But I think this is what we're seeing as a last minute adjustment made as the ship was being loaded. So on the subject of ships, we were intent on raising the architectural elements because they are just as important as all of the other artifacts we raised from the shipwreck. So we did this with the help of a ocean-going tug, the Detect Salver, which you see here, which was provided to us by our friends at TINA. And this ship came down from Istanbul and actually raised all of the column drums. And then you can see them here loaded on the salver and returned them to Bodrum. Here you see the aforementioned Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. The drums are actually not there. All of the other artifacts are undergoing conservation in Bodrum, but it's a little difficult to make room for 60 tons of marble in a museum that is in fact a Crusader castle from the 15th century. So the drums are actually stored nearby temporarily at AINA's Bodrum Research Center, and you can see them here on the grounds of our research center, which is just about 10 minutes or so from the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. And it's there that we are working on cleaning the drums, also sampling the drums. And that's a project that continues, as well as other research involving other artifacts from the Kizilburun shipwreck. And, you know, like all archaeological excavations, there are so many individuals and organizations that played a role in this project. Some, but certainly not all of them, are listed here. And I would just like to close by acknowledging the dozens of students and AINA staff members and volunteers and Turkish commissioners who lived on the side of a rock with me for months at a time. I get to give the AIA presentation, but they deserve just as much credit for the success of this project. So thank you to all of the folks listed here and to all of you who are not listed here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Lots of great questions coming in. I'm not sure we'll have time to get to all of them, but it was also fun watching how many you anticipated. There were a lot of questions about the marble sourcing. So you got to that. And so I think there are a lot of people who are very excited about that. That was like the number one question going into it as we were talking. Another question that we must have a lot of divers in the audience today, because there's a lot of questions about managing the difficulty that you are under. So particularly, sort of how long could the divers stay down? It looked like some of them were only using a single tank. Were you using any rebreathers? Did you use any nitrogen mixing? Like how many dives a day? So that kind of practical stuff, if you could just give us a sense of that, that'd be great.
All good questions. And we do not use rebreathers. We keep things fairly simple on our excavations. We use tables that were written for us by a gentleman named Dick Van, who was at the Divers Alert Network. And these tables have proved very durable in terms of safety, but they call for oxygen decompression. So we dive using air, we wear single or double tanks, which I mean, it's been a while now since I've been in the water, but those are like 18 or 20 liters. The doubles are 20-liter tanks. And we dive on air, and we have a number of profiles that we can work with. And we monitor those based on air consumption, because we don't want anybody running out of air at 140 feet. But the most typical table that we relied on at Kizilburun was a 20-minute dive in the morning and 15 minutes of decompression on oxygen at 6 meters, followed by a 5-hour surface interval, and then a 20-minute dive in the afternoon with, I think, a 20-minute decompression on oxygen at 6 meters. And knock on wood, we had not a single incidence of the bends or any diving accidents, and that's always the most important thing in this business. So great. I hope that covers it.
Yeah, I think it was really great that you started with so much information about just the practicalities of what goes into trying to do this kind of excavation. Right. So a couple of things about the finds. Someone asked about the amphora. Do you have a sense of why it's there? Were they rinsed out and refilled? Were they part of shipping? Do you have ideas about what they were doing there?
Yeah, I think on any shipwreck, you can't assume that all of the amphoras are there because they're cargo. There are certainly evidence for personal consignments. So I think a number of the amphoras in this assemblage, which again is not very large, it's only about 24 amphoras, were probably simply intended for consumption. What the contents were intended to be consumed by the crew, and some of those may include, personal stores. I think of, how we organize our drinks in the excavation. We have one refrigerator, but everybody writes their initials on their Coke or their beverage of choice, and then that goes into the fridge, and you only get, one space for your favorite beverage of the day. So, yeah, I think this is fairly typical. The variety in the assemblage is pretty interesting, and I'm told that this may be the earliest example of the Colchian, the jars from Georgia, from the Black Sea, that the Colchian jars are not found on shipwrecks in the Mediterranean at this period. Maybe they are later on. So, but I think it makes sense that we're looking at a voyage that began in the Sea of Marmara and has some of this sort of Black Sea, the coin, the Colchian amphoras, and then is worked its way southward to Claros. The Lambolia 2 jars are curious, and I have to wonder if there's a Roman presence, maybe even that someone commissioned this column. And I mean, how does that work? Who paid for it? And is that person then responsible for hiring the ship? And these are things I can't answer, but I think maybe one day we'll be able to answer some of those questions.
A few people have some follow-up questions about why exactly they weren't finished when they went on the boat. Like, is it, they want to know, is it to make it less breakable?
Yeah.
Sort of why not do it in the quarry before shipping?
Exactly right. When you flute a column, you create points, right? Those points or flat surfaces are called erises, and they break. All you have to do is spend any time in any public ancient space like an agora or a forum, and you will see the effects of lots of traffic, right? Pedestrian traffic. So those erises are points of not weakness, but they're vulnerable. And of course, you flute a column shaft after you've stacked all the drums one on top of the other. So fluting is basically a refinement. It's one of the last things you do at a construction site. And so what they were doing here is quarrying the pieces as closely to what would be needed at the construction site, and leaving just enough skin on the outside of the column drum so that it could be carved away, but not so much that it made it unnecessarily heavy. So it's surprisingly specific and thoughtful. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So speaking of them, do you think perhaps the weight of them, there's a lot of concern about how heavy marble is. Could that have contributed to the sinking of the ship? And if so, if not, what do you have ideas about why the ship sunk? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the hardest questions to answer. I know that in this part of the coast, of the western coast of Turkey, basically in the straits between Greece, between Chios and Izmir, it's some of the most challenging, baffling winds. And I mean, it's a very difficult place to navigate with winds that change, winds that blow strong and change quickly. There were days we were actually diving at Kizilburun, and you had a very strong northwesterly meltem wind blowing at you, and then you jump in the water and the current was completely contrary and would basically suck you right under the boat. So it must have been a very difficult place to navigate with a square sail. I can't say that the weight of the ship contributed to the sinking, simply because we know of other ships transporting marble cargoes that were 5 times the size of this one. So I'm intrigued by the fact that that we don't have all of the column drums. And I think that must have something to do with the fact that the size of the ship was limited, meaning they were limited in how many drums they could ship by the size of the vessel that they were transported in. And maybe that has something to do with the lading of the drums inside the ship, that they needed a ship with shallow draft to be able to get up close to the quarries to actually load them in the ship. I don't know that we know a lot about the quarries at Proconnesus, but I'm not sure what we know about the fundamentals of loading an ancient ship in the 2nd or 1st century BC there. So that's what I'm thinking, but I'm open to other ideas and suggestions and welcome them.
Great. We've got about 1 minute, and there are a couple of people who really want to know how they can get into doing this. So if you can leave everyone with a bit of advice, yeah, but and you're sort of where could someone go from if they want to do this? Yeah.
Well, you can do what I did, which is to study nautical archaeology at Texas A&M University. That's one of the most direct paths. And another way for those who aren't maybe looking to earn a degree is to support an organization like AINA, like the AIA. You can volunteer. We are, limited by how many folks we can take on a project like this because you've seen the conditions, but just do your best to get involved. Please check out the opportunities available or the projects that AINA is sponsoring at nauticalarch.org. And if possible, if you want to volunteer and we can pair you up with a project director, we're happy to do that.
Great. That's a great place to end here. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions. And I'm sure that Dr. Carlson would be willing to, some of you had some great suggestions for her about possibilities of things to look into. So yeah, please, this is the last one of these for the season, but please check out other local archaeology events and check this out next year too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This was a lot of fun for me.